motivations to to achieve things with your organization, training, that sort of stuff, and also a bit with game balancing. How do you mathematically and analytically balance the game mechanics? So that's me.
I'm Bill Bridges. I'm with CCP White Wolf. Currently working on the World of Darkness MMO. I've been working on CCP White Wolf games for 20 years. Also on Fading Sun, science fiction role-playing game with holistic design.
And I'm Hal Mangold. I'm with Green Ronin Publishing and a company called Atomic Overmind Press as well. And I have done RPG design and layout and generally everything concerning it for about 15 years now.
So let's start with, I guess, a little more of our philosophies on just the art of game mechanics. So my particular philosophy is looking at things, as I mentioned, a couple of you were probably on my talk before, the exploration versus exploitation trade-off. And along with that is also the the whole narrative, the whole experience. So how much do you want the player to explore, both in a literal sense, but also in a gameplay sense? How much do you want them to explore the mechanics of the game versus being told what to do, like use fire against this, use something against something else, and look at that from a more analytical perspective. So my perspective is looking at things, saying, well, you can treat everything as numbers. You can treat it all as the richness, as how do you balance the game, how do you communicate that information, how do you communicate it effectively, and how do you measure it back? And I think that it can tie in a lot with the story and the setting with that. And with that, I'd like to kick it over to Bill, too, because I know you've done a lot with werewolves in particular.
Well, I'd say my philosophy on game design, first of all, I think most gamers love systems on a certain level. They love to crunch these sort of things. I especially love doing that in high school. As I got older, though, I got much more interested in just the storytelling aspects of it, the themes and the mood and stuff, and I'm less interested in the actual mechanics. I still am, obviously, as a gamer. There's no way around that. But, sometimes when I've run games, it's almost systemless, almost rulesless, just, a few random dice rolls now and then. But as a publisher, I think it's really necessary to have a strong rule set for consistency, because what you're hoping gamers do is to not sit at the table arguing. You want them to actually play the game. So there's some sort of a general agreement there through the rules.
And I guess from my perspective, my philosophy would be that the mechanics of a game should support the type of play that you are intending, and play experience that you're intending that the players have. And that comes very much down to the type of style. I mean, speaking for our own games, for instance, we've got very different rule sets. We made a game based off of the computer game Dragon Age, a tabletop version. And that is a very, very different rule set than the game we make for the Game of Thrones role-playing game, which, because, they're completely different sort of animals in terms of the play experience your players are expecting when they approach that game. So I guess that's the key thing to me, is that your rule set needs to be tight and strong and balanced, but only balanced in so much as it supports the gameplay that you want the players to have, I guess. Calculated imbalance can be important, I think.
So I noticed an interesting thing between both of you. Bill, you saying that you like sort of almost a ruleless environment, and then Hal, you're saying that you sort of like this tight rule set.
Well, it all depends. I mean, once again, it depends on what you're trying to do. I mean, there's a big, in the tabletop and role-playing game industry right now, there's a big movement of sort of indie games as well as the bigger games. And a lot of those are much, much more about sort of an interactive storytelling environment, or, I mean, the term I've come up with them for is they're 3/8-inch socket wrench games. If you have to take off a 3/8-inch nut, there is nothing better for doing it than this particular thing. But it's not so good at doing other things. And that all comes down to, are you making a broader rule set? Are you making a narrow rule set? There are very specific, targeted for one type of environment rule sets, and then there are toolkit rule sets, something like GURPS, or even the hero system, which is much more intended to be able to model everything. And those have very different requirements in terms of when you're designing, I think, because with a toolkit rule set, you have to cover everything, and with the other types, you can kind of get to a point, you go, well, we're not going beyond this point, so we don't need to model anything beyond there. So I encompass sort of both of what Bill is getting at and what I was saying, I think, in that rule set design thing. So
I also think there's something to be said about the simplicity of games too. So if you're playing a tabletop game, if your Dungeon Master is sitting there looking up rules half of the time, there's this massively thick rule book, that's not very fun because you're not getting much narrative, you're not doing much, you're not experiencing much, making many decisions. But versus a computer game, I know you guys talked about this a little bit before, you can have more rich models underneath the hood, you can have very complicated things, but at the same time, if the player doesn't quite follow them, then it can break the game a little bit. I know we're all pretty used to Newtonian physics because we live in it, and so if a barrel an empty barrel goes up in the water. Okay, we expect that. But sometimes, especially there's a interesting game called Velocity Raptor, which I don't know if a few of you have heard of that. It's a Flash game that came out recently where you're playing as this raptor that skates on ice, but you're dealing with relativity, where the speed of light is set at 3 meters per second or something like that. So you got all the space distortions and time distortions and information distortions. So you're watching these bullets fly by, and as you move in one direction, the bullets get tighter together or further apart, and how do you maneuver around that? And so sometimes it's difficult to convey those complex rule sets that break our expectations. So I'm wondering if either of you guys can also comment on other examples you can think of where there's preconceived notions of a particular archetype of character or game mechanic that you wanted to break with some sort of innovation and give the players some richer experience, but you had difficulty doing so.
Well, that's a tricky question there. I mean, certainly as far as breaking expectations, I mean, you can do that in very specific fashions. Like the first game that ever came out from Green Ronin Publishing was called Orc, and in it you played an orc. And orcs were, you know, it didn't so much break the expectations as it played into them to the point where it got ludicrous. Or, you know, where orcs are incredibly stupid, ignorant creatures. And actually, but it was funny because the premise of the game contained a really cool mechanic, in as much as everything that an orc did was opposed, or the difficulty of it was determined by how their god Crom felt about what they were doing. So if Crom didn't like what you were doing, he got more dice, and you rolled against your god's feeling on your action to see if Crom hated what you were doing or if Crom liked what you were doing. So it was much easier to do things that he liked. So, you know, orcs were very stupid. So it's a funny game, but it's an interesting thing where the mechanic broke the expectations of what you're generally, you know, usually in role-playing games you're like, what is my target number, or how difficult is this? And the difficulty of this was very fluid. It was very much like, how's the GM feel about what you're trying to do? You know, Crom hates that. That's really hard. You know, so that's the best example I can come up with off the top of my head. Because I mean, a lot of game design is fulfilling expectations, or you know, we don't. It's hard to shatter people's expectations without leaving them completely at sea about what they do in a game. And that's you know, we play with standard tropes all the time in games, and we always go back to the Western mythology models and stuff like that because we don't have to explain a lot. You know, everybody knows the tropes, everybody knows the gigs, everybody knows that dwarves live under the ground and have axes and stuff like that. And so breaking the tropes it's a audacious move when you do it. And I think it's more done in indie games these days than it is in mainstream ones a lot of times.
Right, but I think they can do it because they focus on a lot of indie games is that very specific one thing. We're breaking this trope, and this is how we're doing it. Whereas if you're trying to do a big setting, especially like a kitchen sink setting or whatever, you know, you break too many tropes and it becomes just what the hell's going on here.
Yeah.
We talked about this the other day in a panel of Empire of the Battlefield Attack about it's a great, weird world, but it's so weird and alien, it's very hard for a lot of people to actually sit down and play it.
Yeah, there was a game called Jolroon, which was similarly just rich and great. If you dive into it, it was great, and explaining it to anybody at the top of your head is impossible. It makes no sense whatsoever. This is a place where I think computer games have a significant advantage over tabletop games, because you can break a trope and instantaneously the players see what the result of breaking that is. It's like, oh, physics works differently here. So when I leap off this cliff, I kind of float through the air rather than poof. So
instant feedback.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
Coming more from the science fiction perspective, one thing that always, as a scientist, troubles me a little bit is when I see bad science in film or games or things like that. And we're developing Acron. There was a long discussion we had about whether or not lasers should be visible. And Acron we wanted to keep very hard science fiction in a large number of ways, but it conveys so much information to the player about what you're shooting and where you're shooting it. And we had a long debate about that. Eventually we decided, okay, we'll make most lasers visible except for this one type, which we'll call a certain type, and just have a puff of smoke with it.
Yeah.
And so that was one way that we managed that. But again, some people felt like, oh, this kind of breaks the trope. This breaks what we're used to a little bit.
Right.
Yeah.
It's not space opera.
But I mean, but at the same time, you could at least back-ended yourself into something where it's like, you know, if I had a laser gun and I couldn't see where it was firing, it would be really hard to use that laser gun, you know? So, you know, I think that, but the invisible thing actually, yeah, I mean, I can see where doing it in a limited fashion is just interesting enough that you don't have people going like, whoa, how do I hit things? How do I kill it? You know?
Right, well that's the thing, I mean, hard science is not very romantic. And that's why space opera has lasers you can see and stuff. It has all those little visual cues for you.
Yeah.
It has, you know, lightsabers and such and so forth.
But as an example of where hard sci-fi can be almost a little too dry sometimes, I don't know if anybody ever played 2300, it was a GDW game back in the 90s, and it was the near future 2300 was the year, and it was super hard as far as it could be. But when you come up against weapons where their damage is listed as tamped explosive, you know, where you have to look then at the explosives rules, and it actually gets, the more realistic something is like that, and the harder it is. I mean, if you go too far, you end up with something like Phoenix Command, which was a super realistic, you know, fire combat science fiction game that nobody wanted to play because it was, you know, if you got shot by a gun, well, look, you just died from you know, hydrostatic shock. That's too bad.
Well, the character creation for Traveler used to drive me crazy because you would roll to survive character
Oh,
creation. And the argument for that always was, well, it's realistic. It's like, well, wait a minute. I'm sitting around a table rolling dice. That's not realistic.
It was almost
a certain point here.
It was almost a pregame, right?
Yeah, exactly. You know, just teaching you how tough life is in the military. Okay, 5 characters down. I finally got the 6th one through. I can play.
So as a more of as a PC game and interactive game designer, I want to ask you guys from tabletop perspective, how is it dealing with dice, knowing that you have a uniform probability distribution over so many things, and if you want something other than uniform probability distribution, you have to have a lookup table, or you have to have more complicated, making the game take longer. Mm-hmm. How do you trade off like a probability distribution that you would desire for the feel of a game versus what is easily achievable?
That's a good question.
Well, you know, World of Darkness, there's the old storyteller systems and the newer system. And the old one, the probabilities were all over the place. And it's really hard to calculate them in your head. So you're just going by gut stuff, what just feels right and stuff. In other words, am I going to raise the difficulty here, the target number you have to roll, or do I instead, you know, subtract the number of dice you're going to roll and stuff? In the newer one, all that stuff was fixed and standardized. Difficulty target number stays the same, and it's just the number of dice that are going to go up and down. And partly that was because of it just got so crazy, especially the more dice you roll. And then like the botch rules for the original system, where the more dice you had, the actual easier it was to botch. So then that was revised, so it wasn't the same, but initially it was. So these ancient, powerful vampires would be botching, you know, failing horribly more frequently than the neonates.
Oh yeah, I forgot about that rule.
Yeah, that was crazy. So yeah, all this stuff got revised along the way, but yeah, it's fun because it's a lot of dice, but it's all gut level. Does this feel right?
Yeah. And there wasn't a lot of, I think dice analysis kind of is a newer thing, because certainly when games like, I don't know if everybody ever played first edition Shadowrun, but the calculating the difficulty curve in that game was a nightmare, because you had target numbers, you had numbers of successes, and you had these 2 axes of success, and it was just,
which was modeled off of.
Yeah, and also the I was the brand manager for Deadlands back in the late 90s, and the system was really, really good, but the one part that was always frustrating was figuring, the statistics in that were all based on die types. Like Savage Worlds now is the same way, where it's D68, but back then it was like 4D6, like is 4D6 better than 3D8? Or, you know, what's better, what's worse? And it was really, really hard to calculate. And I think now it's much easier because you've got the internet and you can be like, what's the dice probability of this? And you can probably sum that up on the web pretty quickly. So doing that sort of analysis is a little bit easier. And one thing though is if you constrain stuff too much like that, what it can lead to is it can lead to, well, I mean, it can lead to power gaming and min-maxing, where once you've codified everything to such a certain level, then the players can sort of, you know, use that against the game master. It's a little more, once again, using it against a computer game is good because it makes the player feel smart and they feel like they've beaten it. Using it against a GM can actually be corrosive to everybody's experience, I think, and that's a little trickier thing that computer games don't have to deal with so often, except maybe WoW.
Well, there's those old arguments of simulationist versus narrativist systems and such, and I think simulationist is just, in a pen and paper tabletop environment, I think it's just, you're chasing after the wrong goose there. Whereas in a computer game, yeah, you can get a lot closer to that sort of thing because your odds and stuff can be really infinitesimally calculated by that computer awful quick. But just doing it with dice and charts, you're just going to spend forever sometimes trying to get it just right. And plus, especially in like, you know, an adventure game, you don't want to be but so real. I mean, there's the new edition of Fading Suns, which I didn't actually work on, but it was a licensed property. There was all sorts of argument about putting in radiation rules and stuff because it's realistic. You're in space. You're going to be exposed to radiation. You're going to get cancer. You're going to die. But you really want that? Do you want your character to have that? Even in Gamma World, when you got exposed to radiation, you got a mutation. You got cancer. So, you know.
Yeah, cancer's pretty much the opposite of fun. So.
Unless you have two brains.
Yeah.
Unless you're Liam Neeson in that recent YouTube video. Check that out.
Okay.
So one thing with that is talking about the narrative is linearity versus laterality, if you want to call it that. So talking about when we add radiation, we add these different things to, or somebody says, well, maybe I can jump out of a window of this car. It happened in a game I was playing recently. They said, well, there's a motorcycle driving nearby. It's a cyberpunk game, and I was like, well, I asked the GM, can I jump out of the window of the car and jump these guys? Like, okay, sure. And ended up using a lot of luck points and stuff like that. And did something that was, it didn't break the game, but it was something very far from left field and added a lot to the narrative that we wouldn't have otherwise considered. But at the same time, you also want to have, when designing a game, you want to have some sort of fixed or some amount of narrative, because otherwise you need to basically write a choose-your-own-adventure book, a lot of content, especially in a for PC gaming or for consoles. You have to develop all that assets, you have to develop voice acting, all the storyline, all that kind of stuff, and plan all that out, unless you're doing some sort of newer things with narrative generation. But even that is still, you don't get quite as good stories yet. So I was wondering if you guys have any other comments about...
I just think what you brought up is a concrete trade-off that you make between computer games and tabletop games. Is a computer game can give you all of the calculations done very, very quickly for very, very specific scenarios. But, if I'm playing, let's just say, what's a good example? A good example would be World of Warcraft. I used this in another panel the other day, where in the original World of Warcraft, when you couldn't fly, you didn't have to do stuff behind the scenes because nobody could go there. And if somebody all of a sudden had the ability to fly, the game couldn't have adapted to that. But in a role-playing game around a table, if somebody all of a sudden can fly, the GM head just has to go, all right, well, let's see what happens here. And you can account for errant phenomena and players making, there's never, with the right kind of GM and the right kind of players, there's never a point where the player has to go, can I do this? And the GM has to say no if it's a good idea, if it's something. Whereas in a computer game, the computer game is constantly going no. And it's constantly telling you can't do things. And that's a fact of any game when you start to play, is you figure out, first of all, like, okay, what are the rules? What can't I go through? What doors don't open? What directions can I go? And in an RPG, you can instantly change that, morph that. I've run games where players had a good idea, and I've just gone, yeah, sure, let's roll with that and see where it goes. And it can come out to some really great stuff. And so I guess that's the trade-off. One of the trade-offs between tabletop and computer. What their strengths? Two of their strengths is computers are complexity and sophisticated systems reduced to things you don't even have to think about. And RPGs are complete flexibility and the ability to change the story on a dime just because everybody thinks it should go that way.
That brings to mind an interesting distinction there, where if you look at the so let's take a simple game. The computer tells you no, you can't do this, and says no all the time. But as you grow, let's say you have a very rich sandbox game where you can have tons and tons of things operating all at the same time. Now the computer can model and say yes more often than a GM can, because it's more than a person can model at the same time. So interestingly, I think people sort of bridge that gap and are yes for the middle size, maybe not the two. Yeah,
because the opposite problem of a sandbox game can be, what do I do?
Right.
Do I just run around and climb buildings and punch people, or where's the story? And that's another. Just the flexibility of sitting around a tabletop with your friends and being able to go, okay, guys, you're doing this wrong. Let's just do this thing instead. You can explain stuff, you can stop things. Whereas the computer game requires a much more sophisticated. Also, there's the case of you don't want to make constantly saying no suck. You want to make it an exploratory experience where I'm figuring out the world and I'm being told no, but I'm being told no, which means I can figure out when the game will say yes to me, I guess.
But you're still, again, playing against the game as opposed to a storyteller or game master, because the human mind, imagination, there's just so much more depth and infinite variety.
Yeah.
Which is what's nice about tabletop still.
I mean, the paradigm that sort of mixes the two of those is something like Neverwinter Nights, where you could actually design an online scenario run by a game master. And that's still something that I don't think is, it was out there and people did it, but I don't think it's as fully developed. I think we'll see some really interesting stuff about that in the future. Toolkits for people to create adventures online.
That also brings up an interesting point about content generation. So if you look at different types of media or different types of communicating, if you're reading something, you can absorb stuff at a certain information rate. If you're listening, it's a lesser rate. If you're looking at something, like watching a video of something, it's a different rate, but for different types of things. And but if you're imagining, if you have the GM talking about things and saying, well, here's how I describe it, you're sort of filling in all the details in your own mind. It's sort of a distributed problem. So I just wonder if you talk about a little bit about exploration in games, is it from a narrative perspective. So on the one extreme you have games which are being released now, which are a little more than, okay, press the X button now and then watch a cutscene, all the way through to different sandbox games. There's sort of a, and I think tabletops are an interesting middle point for that. So I wonder if you guys want to talk about the narrative rate and the exploration rate of traversal in the game.
Well, really depends on the game, the time of if you're running, the genres and such. I mean, a game of Vampire may have almost no exploration, except in the sense that you're doing Machiavellian politics with somebody.
Exploring the depths of the vampiric soul.
Or just, how much can you screw that guy by turning his allies against him? Yeah. Especially in a LARP where it's all interpersonal, making deals and stuff. That guy's going to backstab you and so on. It's not so much an exploration except for exploration of the human mind.
Yeah. An interesting part of games versus computer games is also choosing when to gloss over things. Like, I played, which one? It was one of the Elder Scrolls games, not the current one. It was Oblivion, or the one before that.
Morrowind.
But it was the one where you still had to walk everywhere, like everywhere.
Morrowind.
Yeah, and it was an example of gameplay actually getting in the way of the experience of the game, I think, in a way that it would never happen on the tabletop thing, where it's just like, I've walked to this place and I fought the monster, and now I'm going to walk back. In a tabletop game, you go, okay, you walk back. In the computer game, I'm like, I'm walking for 5 minutes, and if I run, I get tired, a monster attacks me, and I die. They fixed that in later games, thankfully. But I mean, that's a case where a computer game didn't correctly calculate I think the narrative rate that things needed to be presented. It didn't calculate when to cut the corners and to actually just cutscene to town, because you don't need to walk back.
But there is something just to be said about that, about exploring. So you're walking into this, you just beat a really tough boss, you're walking into this very rich place where they spend tons of money in the art. It's a really neat experience. You like walking through it, but again, you don't want to walk through it more than once, maybe twice tops. And eventually you want some sort of mode of transportation or method to get through there more quickly.
Yeah. And I mean, that may be a personal preference. Repetition in games is the thing that I have the biggest bugaboo about, is making me do the same thing over and over again. So if I've done it once, please don't make me do it again.
Well, that's the nice thing about sandbox, though, is it can be different depending on what the other players around you are doing.
Oh, absolutely. And also, if there's a GM and if it's player content, certainly walking through the same place in WoW, which I've done over and over again, is never the same thing twice.
And there's also different details about what you're glossing over. Remember, way back when, a long time ago, I played a game, Eye of the Beholder, there was a PC a long time ago, and that game really stuck out to me because you had to manage food, you had to manage water of your party, and at first I'm like, wow, this is really cool, they really got all this stuff, and I'm like, I hate doing this. And I can't think of any games that I've seen, or many games that I've seen do things like that recently. And just like you never see people enter bathrooms in the movies because it's kind of boring.
Right, yeah. Yeah, like we talked on the panel on tabletop to computer game stuff that we did talk about the other day about Baldur's Gate, which was very, very, a direct translation of the tabletop experience into the computer game. Did you have to manage food and water in that? I can't remember. Baldur's Gate. Well, you were one character in Baldur's Gate, weren't you?
No, you could be 6.
No, that was fun. No, that was
You could be
Planescape.
6. And
Okay.
there's no food or water in Baldur's Gate.
Okay, yeah.
You did have to rest for your spells, though, and that was, I think there was some sort of limit where if you rested for spells, you can't rest for another couple of days.
Yeah.
Okay, so resting, that's an odd one.
So a lot of translation of that sort of stuff of the tabletop experience and along with its mechanics has been learning what mechanics to dispose of. And honestly, a lot of this mechanics have just gotten disposed of in tabletop too. I think that there's much less emphasis in a lot of games now on the you didn't plan for enough water. It looks like you're dead. Except with the exception of maybe Dark Sun. Recently, they actually had rules for that.
I think a lot of that has gone away as the dungeoning aspect of the games has gone away. It doesn't take as much focus because the idea there is you're on an expedition. You got to get way to the bottom, so you got to manage these resources as part of the thing.
Yeah.
Am I doing this right? Am I memorizing the right spells? Am I carrying the right amount of water and so on?
Yeah.
But the more it becomes just a social game, or we're going to go into town now, we're going to take on the Thieves Guild. Who cares what you're carrying at that point?
Yeah, and I think that maybe enough games didn't make the distinction about when you should implement that sort of stuff.
Right.
That those rules have a place because when you're worrying about it when you're going on a dungeon crawl or something, that's a part of your narrative right there. You're like the monster's destroyed half your water.
Oh,
that's a problem.
No water.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
On the flip side, though, if you let things too loose, so you have sort of a path dependence. If you go into the dungeon and you have to plan for all of these different things, and oh, you lost some of the water, but you didn't have enough resources, and now you're, I don't know, an hour into it, and you realize I got to do this whole thing over again. And even though I've saved several times, those weren't good enough. I need to go back and replan everything differently. It frustrates you as a player. However, on the flip side, if you can redo stuff so easily, like take EA's game Spore, for example. In there, you can create basically any type of creature you wanted, and they were all kind of equal. You couldn't make a creature that you evolve your creature, and it couldn't be something that was so bad that you had to start over again. And that sort of hurt the feel of the game too, because now you can get to the goal any way, and it's so simple in a way.
Yeah, that almost becomes not a game, really. That becomes, may become an experience, and I think that's the danger of removing the narrative. Even if that narrative is, the story of your creature evolving successfully. Because if you remove the failure rate, then you've got the story of your creature evolving. And that's not really a story, that's just you're watching a process.
Yeah, it's not evolution if there's not adaptation and there's failures.
Yeah, yeah. Another thing that the two bugaboos were always like food and water and encumbrance, right? And encumbrance has actually evolved in computer games too, because if you think about like old first-person shooters where you were carrying like an entire arsenal on your back, and not every, some shooters are still like that. Like I don't think Serious Sam you need to worry about that sort of thing. But a lot of games now are like you have X number of weapon slots. What are you going to carry? And what you choose is actually important to how you deal with the story as you go forward. So, and I think that's a good thing. It's like, whoops, picked the wrong weapons. Oh, that's a problem once again.
Having been immersed in the world of darkness for so long, it's always so alien to me to go back to a game that does calculate encumbrance and money and how many pieces of gold you have, how many copper. Because Vampire, you have resources dots 1 through 5, and that tells you how rich you are.
But
you can get something or not.
I think that speaks to how the type of players that play certain games though too. Like no storyteller player, if the GM goes, you can't carry all that, is going to go right here. It says, Whereas with other games, there might be arguments like that. And this is the part where a tighter rule set, getting back to the tighter rule set and everything like that, can feed into that, where the player can go, clearly right here it says that I can carry all that. And the GM has no recourse but to go, gah!
Or if bags of holding burn.
Yeah, pretty much.
Or treasure chests in Resident Evil.
Yeah.
That also goes to different player. You mentioned different player types. There's some players that are curators of what they do, and they like micromanaging all that stuff. They'll have all their materials and everything packaged in there and bin packing just so they fit everything they possibly can. There's some players like that a lot.
They do. They do. Yeah, it is. It is. And I guess a rule set. A GM who has a player who likes that could be like, well, all right, let's do something on the fly to reward you for that or something. That might be a way to view it. It's like if somebody wants to do that and the rule set doesn't actually support it, you can positively reward the player for taking steps that would concretely be good ideas if they were supported by the rule set. I think. I've never had to do that just because I've never played with people that actually likes doing encumbrance. But,
There's also another interesting game called Gratuitous Space Battles. It was an indie game that came out a few years ago where the game was all about configuration management. So it was a spacecraft game. You built and configured all your spaceships, and then you let them go, and the AI fought. And then you watched that. And I personally wasn't a huge fan of the game, although I thought some of the aspects were really cool, but it focused all on that. And part of it was the discovery of figuring out what combinations of things work, which ones don't, and but also trying to tell you how they work. It reminded me, there was a game I played recently at Tabletop where we got bogged down for probably like an hour working on the configuration. By the end, people were kind of bored, but nobody wanted to agree on how to exactly configure the ship.
Sounds like an interesting game because that's a case where you're revealing the system to the player through trial and error. Like they put something together, you go out there, and if they're watching the fight, they learn something about the system underlying things and how to configure their next one. Can you do that at Tabletop? I'm trying to think. That would be really, really interesting to play a game where the mechanics, the players literally don't know them until they play it.
Gosh, I can't think of an example.
I know.
It's a great one.
That's actually kind of an interesting
trying to do all this planning
idea.
And unleashing and just watching and having to then recalculate.
Where you just set up a premise and you don't tell the players. There's certainly been games where you've told the players. Like, do you remember, was it Fall of the Phoenix? There was this one particular game that I'm not ruining anything because it was a fantasy game, a limited game, and you're never going to find a copy of it. But I think it was. And you made up your players as a bunch of astronauts. And that was the premise of it. You put your players in the spaceship, and you tell the players this is a space exploration game, and you set them up for it, and what it actually is they go up into space, and there's like some sort of weird dimensional shift, and they come back to Earth, and everything is different. So you lie to your players about what the game's about, and then they come back and everything. Like I think it's become like.
There's another game called Action Castle, which is there's a few games in this genre where it's a text adventure via spoken text. And there's a few guys I know who run this at some different conventions, like the Geek Nights guys, Rim and Scott, where you go up there, you have the person who says the things, reads off just like you would a text adventure, and then you have a queue of people, every person gives a command. They
did this last night at the D20 burlesque show.
Okay,
they did Action Tavern. It was pretty funny.
Zork striptease.
Yeah, pretty much.
So the interesting thing about that, about Discovery, is that they'll be playing and people will say up, or climb the ladder, or the different valid moves, and if they don't get it right, the narrator says, sorry, I can't do that, or some.
That was the funniest thing was watching the people who had never played a text adventure, and they'd say something that made no sense, and the person would go like, sorry, I can't do that.
Yeah.
Shoot,
next
person in line. Yeah.
And someone experienced will say save or restore.
Yeah.
It's like game saved.
Yeah, the one guy finally did check his inventory, and that was cool. Inventory.
And it even had the persuasion thing where like one person went the place they shouldn't have gone, and they were killed and the game ended, and the next person had to start it over. Which was kind of funny.
So one thing about game rule discovery, which I feel like has changed a little bit, back in the 80s, you had an instruction book that you always had to read for the games and figure things out. And like, oh, how do I pass this chasm, whatever. You had to figure that out. Versus now, I feel like everything is guided. The first time you're shown how to do something, or the first time you do something, you're shown explicitly how to do it. And maybe the game will have you put two things together which you didn't know before, but that's at most. And I'm not sure if that's necessarily, maybe that's why we haven't seen such games where you discover more of the rules anymore.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, like, I'm behind the times, and I just started playing Assassin's Creed recently, and there's stuff in that opening part that you'd never figure out in a million years if the game didn't show you how to do it, like the disappearing socially and that sort of stuff. You really need to be shown how to do that. But there's some things, like the climbing, that, I can figure that out. I mean, it'd be better if the game had shown me that just the stuff that I hadn't, that there was no possibility of me knowing how to run it, I guess. Would be interesting.
Yeah, I mean, ideally you wouldn't need a tutorial, but if you just got something weird in there that you're not expecting.
Yeah, I mean, when you're wrapping human actions onto a controller.
It feels cheated that I could have been doing that all along.
Yeah.
And there's also the expectations that we talked about before. If a player's played this genre before, they expect, oh, this is how things should generally work. But sometimes it's very difficult to. So for us, when making an RTS, we had a few constraints with Acron that other games don't have. So we had the time manipulation aspect, but that put such a strong burden on our computational resources that we had to make some shortcuts that hadn't been seen in years for games, in terms of pathfinding, in terms of like tile-based movement versus physics-based collisions and stuff like that. And so in some ways, younger players who had not played earlier games in the genre were more lost than older players.
Interesting. Interesting. I never thought of that sort of.
Wow.
So there are some generational aspects to that. And there's also some examples, if you've seen, somebody a long time ago made a video of what Super Mario Brothers, the first game, would be like if you played it today. Where it's like, here's the Goomba, press A now to jump.
Yeah. Yeah. That's actually, I hadn't even thought about that, but yeah, we've become so used to hand-holding the way you're introduced to games that, and I think, that's an interesting thing because there's an opposite movement, I think, in tabletop games where right now there's a lot of emphasis on, because it's not quite so evident, we can't show you, like teaching the player how to play as they read the game is, or, telling them not only how to play the system, but what kind of game they are playing is a very important thing. And I think because D&D's easy, everybody knows what that is. Kick down the door, kill the monster, take the treasure. But other games, the expectations are totally different, and you have to really tell people how the game has been designed to be played, I think is what it comes down to. Because if you try to play every game like D&D, it really won't work out so well, I mean, unless you have fun, which is the most important thing about every game, is if you have fun, then that's really the heart of it,
So actually that reminds me of one other thing with trying to have enough of a rule set that you can start off the game playing with and have fun with it. So if you have a few actions that you can do, a few items, whatever, you want to make sure that that's fun enough to get the player hooked. Otherwise, if they need to read the entire rule book for a tabletop game or have tons and tons of items before it gets interesting, then they're not going to play it. So there's a lot of platformer games where, okay, I've played a bajillion platformers and they're all the same, but this one has some really cool stuff, but we need to get you through all these hoops before you can play the cool stuff.
Like Braid might be a really interesting example of that, where it subverts a lot of your expectations of what a platformer is and how it works. And that game is almost ruthless in not explaining it to you. It's like, you really have to figure out what's going on and watch things and trial and error and stuff. And I thought that was a very interesting experience when I played it, to try and figure. That was a case where I think that, once again, the system sort of reveals it's revealed to you by you just trying stuff, and it doesn't work.
Figuring out how to do it is part of the gameplay.
And at the same time, I think it's important to design that if you're going to make that type of game, that the price for failure is not a pain in the butt. It's like you're back in the game really quickly and applying what you learned, because you don't want to start the entire thing over again if you just because you didn't figure out the game's particular little way that something worked.
Yeah, that's the thing, like those arcade games in there. I remember playing some of those way back when. And of course, the price of failure there is, God, another quarter.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, lost so much money on those things way back then.
Yeah.
And then there's the roguelike games which embrace death. It's all procedural content, and every time you play through the game, it's different. The whole layout's different, the enemies that you encounter are different, and people sort of like that. It's not my thing, but there's a culture around embracing death and embracing new experiences with that.
Yeah. Where would you play something? I just played Journey, and I'm interested to see where it would fit in here, because the rules of that game are very simple once you figured them out, and the system is never revealed to you at all. The system is totally opaque. It's almost more an experience, but it still feels like a game. Because there are enough puzzles to solve and things to do, and threats and things like that. But that's an interesting. It lies on the cusp, I think, between game and experience. I mean, have you guys played it at all?
Yeah. I'm gonna go ahead and describe it because I'm not.
Have you guys played Journey at all?
Yeah.
Okay, so you have. Yeah, you go ahead and describe it.
Okay, so it's the journey of life. You start off as this. It's been a number of years, so fill in things that I played. But you walk the journey of life, and it's like you just move around. But as you move towards the right, you get older. And
no! This is a different game. This is a different game. No, this game literally. You start out in the desert. You're this cloaked figure, and you start walking toward. There's this mountain with a light on it, and you start walking toward it.
Oh, is this that game company's game?
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah,
I was thinking of a different game.
Okay, yeah. And it's interesting because you learn that you can sing a song that will activate some things, and as you go along, you have this sash behind you that gets longer and longer as you do certain things, and you can fly around a little bit. And it's funny because there actually aren't a lot of walls or constraints showing you the way. You just there's this big mountain, and it seems like a good idea to head toward it, and it sort of goes from there. And there are things that you have to open, and things that you have to sort of build and stuff. And there's another aspect as well that I think if you're online at the same time, I only encountered one other player in my journey when I played it. But other players who are online, you can encounter them in the same place at the same time. They look exactly like you and stuff. But it was a very interesting experience to sort of having something that was so close to game and so close to not game at the same time, I think.
So to describe I believe the game's called The Journey of Life, which is the one that I thought you were describing, is very similar in a way where you start off as this character that you're just on this flat map, and you start walking, and you realize as you walk to the right, you age. You're a kid. And eventually you can find things like you can get things that earn you stuff, like I forget how it works, but at different points you can find a wife, and then as you keep on moving to the right, or you make different progress through it. Well, passage, that's what it's called. And you pass through life, and again, it's one of those questions: is this a game? Is it not? Or is it an experience? And it lies right between the two of them.
Yeah, and I guess those are much less system dependent in terms of the game system underneath them. It would be interesting. This is the case where it'd be interesting to actually talk to the designers and be like, so what is the system behind this? Is this just a movie? Am I just going through these motions, or is there an actual system for what I'm doing?
Well, when you repeat it, is it different each time? How?
This the passage.
I haven't done it again, so I don't know. I know it'll be different because you encounter different people, and like certain things can get done and opened in quicker fashion. Like I went through this one section where if there'd been nobody there, it probably would have taken me half an hour. But this dude who'd obviously done it before went around and did everything, and I just kind of followed along, and it worked out pretty well. But it was an interesting experience. That's something that would be actually very hard to replicate, I think, in the tabletop. I think the only way you could really do that is with DVD player and a movie, really. So.
On the flip side, there's also a game I like to highlight that takes away the experience as much as possible. It's called You Have to Burn the Rope. And this was sort of a spoof game in 2009 that got a lot of critics talking, where you come into the game, and the name of the game is you have to burn the rope. And all of the instructions, you're walking through this really simple, super simple platform where you cannot die, and everything is telling you how to beat the boss, where you go up and you burn the rope, and then you burn the rope and kill him. And that's the whole game. But it's just showing how simplified and how tutorial-oriented and how lack of a game some games are today.
Yeah. That's interesting. Should we take some questions?
Sure. You want to take some? Okay.
Anybody have any questions out there?
Go ahead.
Like a game like Demon's Soul, where you can choose between either helping another player or screwing them over. How important would be a balance in making sure that players can get through a certain level? Because I mean, Atlas games are notorious for having amped up difficulty, but kind of how do you determine where is that balance between being able to progress without somebody there?
I would think it depends entirely on your goals for the game. I mean, is it a competitive game or is it a cooperative game? And if you're trying to make a statement about, both, how you need both, some balance is good, but otherwise.
In my experience, people tend to prefer a clean-cut collaboration or competition in general in their games. So in Acron, with all the time manipulation, we have the ability to change alliances during gameplay. During any point in time. Now, if you're playing an RTS and you say, well, I'm going to ally with someone else and now I'm going to break that alliance, that creates some strife. But when you can go back in time and say, I never wanted to have had this alliance to begin with, and undo that. Players basically were like, wow, this is powerful and amazing, but nobody wanted to touch it because they wanted to keep all of their friends. And as I talked about earlier in my previous talk about game theory, is there's an interesting cusp where you have the Nash equilibrium where you're doing the best that you can given everybody else's strategy, and the Pareto optimality where nobody can be made better off without making someone worse off. And when those are in misalignment, that's when you get Mexican standoffs, that's when you get people who are backstabbing each other, and that's fun and interesting. It happens all the time in the real world, but it creates tension and animosity among game players sometimes. So you have to be very delicate with how you apply those in game design, I think.
Just as a side note, time travel is probably a focus for a game that is as difficult on the tabletop as it is, if you want to do it realistically. There was only one time travel RPG I can remember, and that was Continuum. You remember that thing?
Yeah.
And that game, the fact that it had 3 supplements, it didn't sell so well, isn't a testament to it being a bad game. It's a testament to how freaking hard it is to wrap your head around actual time travel if you're trying to game it out, whether you've got a computer or not. I mean.
Well, it's one of those things where it baffles any attempt to do a lot of heavy detail work in your game because someone just comes in and does it really quick by changing time and such.
Yeah.
We got around that with the chrono energy though, and that worked pretty well, but even today there's some people who they have their own mental model of time travel from various fiction that they've encountered, and most of the time, 99% of the stuff out there is not internally consistent.
Right.
And they're used to that, but then when you're in a consistent system, they feel like, oh, I can't break it, I'm stuck.
I think that's the hazard of taking time travel from fantasy to science. Fantasy time travel doesn't have to be consistent. Time's a river. Great.
Really wobbly.
But when you do science, it's a little harder.
Try to be whiny.
Since creating game design can be such a various project, different ideas coming at you with different stories, needing different type of game mechanics, where do you guys like to start when you're beginning such a colossus project?
I guess to me, I'd always start with story. I mean, I don't mean story like here is the narrative but more like what types of stories do you want the game to facilitate and tell? I think that's the general thing. I'm sorry. The question was when you're designing a game and you're trying to determine the basically where do you start? What do you the first things you choose as your starting point to determine when you're designing a game like that? And like I said, for me, it's you got the overall stories that you want to be able to tell in the game, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. That's certainly where I started with Fading Suns, which was that the system came after the idea of what are we building here? What's the game? What kind of stories are you telling? What kind of players are you? What kind of people are you going to play? And all that. And then, of course, Fading Suns was very intentionally a kitchen sink science fiction thing, so it had to be a system that was broad enough to handle a huge range of things.
as the black sheep here who works more on PC games and strategy type, like RTS type games, we think more about what do we want the player to think about first? What type of decisions do we want them to make, and what type of information do we want them to assimilate to make those decisions? Because that's really what the, from a strategy perspective, what the immersion is about. Where's their head at? We don't want them to be bogged down in details that don't matter to them. We want them to be making interesting and engaging experiences that fit with, I mean, it does fit with the narrative, and that is very important, that fit with their preconceived notions of what they're playing. And then start there and say, okay, what do we need to focus on? What are the important aspects of gameplay, and what parts do not matter? And then do some exploration there, because sometimes you end up with a game mechanic that, oh, we thought this was a great idea, playtest it, nobody cares about it. This other part of the game is really cool. We should flesh that out more. And so there is a little bit of an exploration in that regard too. I've heard some guys at Valve talk about that, where I forget whose philosophy there was. You take you make a bunch of game mechanics, and you find the 2 minutes of gameplay that is the best and most fun, and you make the game out of that. And then you do that initial exploration, and then you exploit that 2 minutes of gameplay.
Yeah, and on the flip side, from the tabletop perspective, sometimes you just come across like a killer mechanic, and you go, "That's really neat. Like, what does this fit?" And I think a lot of indie games have come up that way, where somebody's like, "This is a really cool way to model X," and you know, if it models X really well and X is fun, just make X, and sometimes you don't have to worry about a broader rule set. So.
There was one commentator, I forget who it was blogging back in the around 2009 after experimental gameplay sessions, talking about how he felt that a lot of indie game developers were now deconstructing and reconstructing game mechanics in ways that are brand new. A couple examples. One was Shadow Physics, which I don't think was ever made yet. I hope they make this game, because it was so cool, where you played as a shadow in a three-dimensional world. And there's a ball, there's 2 light sources. You push the ball with one shadow, the ball would roll that way. You jump around to the platform and push it the other way, so you interacted with the 3D world through the shadows. And taking and looking at things from new perspective, like light and darkness or sound. There's another friend of mine who made a game that called Aura that had no graphics. You just listened.
How do you spell that?
Aura, I think it's called Aura the Unseen, like A-U-R-A. It made it like 4 or 5 years ago. It didn't sell that many copies, but you had to like listen in different directions. It was a tile-based puzzle game. Think about it, kind of dungeon crawling in The Legend of Zelda, the original. That's kind of what it was like. But looking at what can we remove from a game and how can we take these pieces and put them together in new ways. Another one, Megacure, the 4-dimensional platformer, where your L and R buttons are sliding through the 4th dimension. And you can take two circles, 2 rings that are rings in 3 dimensions, and interlock them via the 4th dimension.
I mean, Portal is probably the highest profile example of that.
Exactly, yeah.
On the tabletop side, there's a game called Dread, which is an indie game that's a horror game, and the tension of the horror is facilitated by a Jenga tower. And you got towers going, and every time the dread level rises, you remove towers from the, And it's a really interesting way of using a physical object to actually provoke the emotional response you're trying to get from the players in the game. I haven't played it personally, but I've had friends who played it, and they say it actually really works. And like toward the end, you're like super tense, pulling stuff out. So that's an interesting way of taking something, taking a completely other thing from a completely other game, and just going, we could make a role-playing game about this, and it works.
We had
and it's a mechanic too. That's the coolest thing.
We had similar comments from a few people about Acron, where they said it feels to us like a survival horror game in a way, because there's always this unsettling feeling that someone's going to go back in time and change something. You see them pop back and pass, and what are they changing? You have to go figure that and discover it. And there is that sense of surprisal where horror is all about being surprised in an unpositive way, and how do you harness that in different ways that aren't necessarily scary, that don't frighten people and broaden your player base?
Yeah. It was a cell phone game we were really into for a little while, a few months ago, maybe a year ago. The Shadow Cities, did you ever play that? Where it uses your GPS on your smartphone, and then you set up your own little realm of sorts around your house. And it set up little towers, and you get little powers and stuff, but you're fighting against other people, and they've got their realms. And so you have to do is get in your car, go to the physical, actual realm. Like at night, go outside past the guy's house and let's attack him. While he's not paying attention, and all of a sudden he comes on. Oh shit, there he is! Stronger than me. Get out of here. So that was, we were like all over town. And just started knocking out towers.
Should we take another question? Anybody else? Let's see somebody in the back there, that guy back there.
So, I was looking at the difference, and it kind of came up a little bit, made me think of it when you guys were talking about carrying capacity or managing food in games. That kind of adds an element of like grittiness or realism, and so really the talk with the name of the talk, with art and mechanics is, if you want to make sure that the players feel something, I feel like you give it a mechanic, and that's saying like this game focuses on this thing. But sometimes, and especially like reading through Werewolf the Apocalypse, one of the things they didn't give the werewolves a mechanic for at all was how spirits specifically interact with werewolves after a death rage. And so it's like kind of leave it up to the storyteller, but what is important? Like how do you make the decision to go, there's not a mechanic, and so it doesn't have the mechanical weight, but you still want your players, you still want it to be an element of the game. What makes a decision? What makes a differentiation between handing it to your players and saying, we can't codify this because it would not do it justice, or what makes that decision? Like what gives you the onus to say, no, this is a mechanic, yes, this is?
Well, it really just spirits especially is one that you over mechanicize those sort of things, and then they don't feel like spirits. They feel like widgets that you're just plugging something into. And since they were something of the other world, they're supposed to be a little more mysterious. And it's something I wish I had explored more when I was actually working on Werewolf, and because there's so much of a richness there in those interactions and in those relationships. And there's a tendency, because of the gifts and such, where you learn this from a badger spirit, where it seems like it's just a very simple one-to-one, okay, I learned this, and ta-da. But there should be a little more, interaction going on there. What does that badger spirit want? And so, yeah, I wish that had, we'd done a lot more work on that. And who knows, maybe in the future we will be.
And I think a lot of things you can do in role-playing games is you can without like reducing something to numbers, you can codify how it works. And you don't have to turn it into a die roll, and maybe that's sort of the area where you wish you'd gone a little further. You didn't want to turn it into a die roll.
There was the concept of chiminage. You had to give them something.
Yeah.
It's very open, and we should have gone into a lot more guidelines, I think.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that's one thing another thing that role-playing games can do is after they're out, you can go, well, we didn't, well, here's some more information on that,
Right.
And it's a little easier, once a computer game is and some are updatable, certainly, something like, where you have point releases and things, but it's super easy to go on your website and go, hey, this is how that works, or something like that. But a lot of it's just gut feeling though, right? I mean, and sometimes you just don't know. Like, you put something out and something you think is a throwaway deal turns out to be something that players are like, this is super important, and you go, whoops, well, I guess I need more rules on it.
We'll revise that away and change
Yeah.
that.
And different editions of games are always a way for that. Like Shadowrun's an example. The first edition, the rules were a mess. The decking, one of the core things of the game was this whole sort of human-computer interface thing, and the rules were just terrible. I mean, I ran the game and I pretty much just rolled dice and made stuff up as the GM because they just didn't support the actual play that they intended. I mean, that's an interesting thing to think about is what do you do when you encounter a rule that is antithetical to the type of play that somehow has made it into a published product? And the rule, mine is just you ignore it, frankly.
Actually, you're all getting, I've said this before. One of my problems with Shadowrun is it's this great, rich setting, but actually playing it, part of this is because of the rules. It almost then all of a sudden becomes 3 separate solo adventures, or sort of.
Yeah.
Because then you've got your hackers going into the cyberspace,
Yeah.
and nobody else is there with him, even though they're physically in the same location. The astral guy, he's in the astral plane.
Yeah, yeah.
And then us, we're fighting the guards here. And I wish they'd done a lot more to try to integrate these experiences that are all going on at the same time.
I think they've done that over through the editions. And I think that's been one of those recursive. I mean, they're in their 5th edition now. Yeah, it's a tough thing. But yeah, that's an example of where the world you're sold and that you want to play in, the system doesn't support the group play that you want to have, the group experience you want to have necessarily. And but then again, the rules, I think that probably is more like, that was more you need to be told how to apply the rules rather than necessarily changing the rules.
Right, but it's a case in other games, falling into this sort of thing. I'm not singling out Shadowrun, but it's just an example of the whole basic part of a tabletop game is the experience of a group. It's not a solo game for the most part.
Yeah.
And a lot of games I think don't take enough of that in consideration. And one of the things I really liked about Werewolf is you could have a pack, and that's already a pre-existing idea. Wolves have packs, and
Yeah.
it's great. It fits so well. It's a great morphology from the real world into this world.
Yeah.
And pay more attention to those sort of things that people are going to be together, and they're not going to want to split the party all the time.
Yeah,
Reasons not to split the
Or
party.
the old card, you meet in a tavern.
But then if you have too many house rules or you have different configuration spaces, you end up with players who are getting good at it and enjoy playing completely different versions of the game. So for example, if you have a fighting game and there are certain item drops and some players like, I think this item breaks the game, I don't like playing with this, so I'm going to use these items instead, and another player uses the other items, you can end up with very, very different games. You know, if you have everybody who's just using bazookas in a first-person shooter and that's it, it's a very different game than knife fighting, right? But and there are different servers that run those sort of different things, but they are really quite different games.
Yeah, different flavors of the same game. Everybody has to be on the same page in terms of what you're playing as a group. I think that's definitely true. Or you end up with a troublemaker.
It's strange. I mean, one of the weirder, way back when Chaosium published something, and they had rules for all sorts of different game systems, and one of them was Traveler. And so we're playing our Traveler game, and our game master, we crash landed on the Thieves World. And one of the characters in there, I wasn't familiar with him at that point, is a guy who just every time you hit him, he regenerates, and so he's just going to keep coming back. And my friend got so angry at this, but it's basically worked his way back to our crash ship to get his plasma gun in the hopes that that would take the darn thing down. And so then you've got this guy running around with a plasma gun in what is a fantasy world. It's just weird.
By the way, Thieves World were a series of books from the 80s and 90s by Lynn Abbey and Robert Aspirin, and we're really old. So.
It's a fantasy. Oh, we're done. We got 0 time. What's that?
5 minutes.
5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay. Let's do
Last few questions.
couple questions.
Let's go, yours.
Yeah, so you mentioned early on about breaking the game balance for the sake of making the game better. Could you give like an example of that and kind of how you would do that without unwanted side effects?
To be honest, no. It was a flip comment off the top of my head, and I think it could have a valuable gameplay thing, but I've never successfully applied it.
Yeah.
But as a concept, I think it's a valid one, and I think that there's fun to be had there with it. But I've never successfully done it.
2 comments to that. One, go back in time and watch my talk at 3 o'clock, or 3:30, 3 o'clock. And another comment about that is sometimes by breaking the rules or changing them up a bit, you get people who are used to playing one way to be on an equal footing. So for example, I'm not a great chess player, but sometimes they'll say, well, let's change up the rules a bit and play a chess variant, and then people who are better at chess than I am, we can play on more equal footing.
I actually just thought of an example, and that would be Ars Magica, which is a fantasy game in which you're playing medieval wizards and sorcerers, and it's a very, very hermetic, like wizardry is something you have to do very carefully and all this kind of stuff. And usually in a troupe, there's one wizard. And the wizard is far more powerful than everybody else. And the game actually encourages troupe play so that people switch characters from time to time so that nobody has to always be the wizard. But it's a case where the wizard can, is powerful enough to burn all of his other companions if he felt like it. And that's a case where the player balance is completely off. There's a lot of fun to be had because the wizard, while he's the most powerful, he doesn't like to go hit things. That's why he has the hitty things dudes that he sends off to do that. But that's about the only example I can think of off the top of my head where imbalance between power of players is an actual feature of the game and a feature of the way it's played rather than a bug.
Something kind of related is natural selection, where it's an RTS and first-person shooter at once. So one player is the general, and then everyone else is the infantry.
Yeah, that's a good one. Can we take out one more before we go? Let's see. Let's with this gentleman here.
Okay. Yeah. I was thinking about in terms of when making game design and you've got your mechanics set up. How do you go about deciding how complex you really want the mechanics? Like if I were to give it to example to a video game, when do you decide to go with an inventory system from Final Fantasy where you have unlimited spots for everything, but everything going to be 99, to Diablo where everything has a shape and formats to fit in your bag?
Well, it's about the design of the game and the goals. I mean, there's something that's called Diablo Barbie for boys. It's about accessorizing part. You're going for intellectual stuff. So that system is there to facilitate that exact kind of gameplay.
And the contrast between sophistication and complexity should probably be brought up here, where something can be sophisticated, which means there are a lot of permutations to it and a lot of depth to it, and it can look complex, but I think actual complexity is when something is actually difficult to no purpose, I think. Would that be a good definition of complexity within games?
Yes and no. I mean,
In the
you have
context
a
we're talking
necessary
about.
inventory system, But sometimes, I mean, there's studies now saying how much you can really fit in your head, just how many
Yeah,
choices
there's
you
a
can make
card
at
game
any time.
things where it's like the reason most card games have 7 cards as the hand is because that's like cerebrally what most human beings can handle the choices of.
Yeah, so complexity is making more choices than you can actually.
That's actually true. I'm probably simplifying complexity too much.
Yeah, so it might be more of a permutation for complexity, and sophistication being the richness of thinking that goes into something you can manage in your head at once.
Yeah, it's how you apply the complexity and how you
Yeah.
present it at the same time, I think. Yeah. Good. We probably do one more since nobody's come in yet.